What is up, guys? In today's video, we're going to be talking about linear versus exponential controller settings, because this is a question that controller players seem to always be confused about, or kind of asking themselves like which one they should play or which one their favorite like pro player or content creator plays. So in today's video, I'm going to be going over the difference between linear and expo, the advantages and disadvantages of each, and my recommendation for what you should play based on kind of the type of player you are. As always, if you guys do enjoy this video, find it helpful, informative, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and comment down below if you play linear or expo. So for starters, there is no right answer. This is mainly just preference and playstyle. There are great exponential players and there are great linear players. Linear is probably the most common settings among like top tier controller players and pro controller players, but that doesn't mean you have to play linear to be good. And that doesn't mean if you switch to linear, you're just magically going to be like significantly better than you currently are. Being good on linear or being good on expo just takes practice, and it really depends on your playstyle. And also, the advantages and disadvantages of each that I talk about is just going to be what the settings lends themselves to. It doesn't mean that if you play expo, you're automatically going to have godlike AR tracking and terrible building, or if you play linear, you're going to have godlike building and terrible AR aim. Like, the advantages and disadvantages of each can be overcome if you put the time in and if you practice. And the main difference between linear and expo is how your sensitivity responds to stick movement. So on exponential, you essentially get a ramp up time with your sensitivity. There will be a graph on here on screen that shows it based on how much you move the stick. If you move the stick a little bit, your sensitivity is going to be slower than it typically is. But when you push your stick all the way to the side, that's when you're going to get your max sensitivity movement. Like how this graph shows, that slow ramp up would be like if you're barely touching your stick or you're moving it very slowly, and then at the end when it's going fast would be like when you're max pulling your analog stick all the way to the edge of the controller. With linear, your sensitivity will feel the same regardless of how much you're moving the stick. If you barely touch it, your sensitivity is going to feel the same as if you moved it all the way to the side. It's very consistent, and it is just the raw stick input. And the reason why a lot of people like linear is it's kind of better for making large adjustments because of that, and it makes your sensitivity feel more consistent, even though it is harder to control early on. And the reason why this really matters is because one of the biggest weaknesses of controller is when you have your stick pushed all the way to one side, and then you need to make a large adjustment to the opposite side. So let's say you have your stick pushed to the far left, and then you need to go far right for whatever reason. You're on far left. You have to kind of like push it through the left back to center, and then through the right to far right. You know what I'm saying? And obviously you could do this insanely fast, but if your sensitivity is kind of adjusting based on how much you're moving the stick, that inner right period might be a little bit slower. That inner left period might be a little bit slower. And this is just one of the key weaknesses of controller in general is to make a large adjustment, you have to go all the way opposite the direction you were just in. And this is kind of the crux of linear versus expo. On expo, those situations aren't going to feel as good. On linear, those situations are going to feel better, but expo or linear obviously comes with its own downsides, which we'll get to later on. The pros for exponential settings is because of that slower ramp up time, it's more controlled and it's easier to make small adjustments, especially at long range. If you're just barely off of somebody, you can move your stick a little bit and get it there. Whereas on linear, since you don't have that slow ramp up time for your sensitivity, it could be very hard to make very small, precise adjustments at long range. The fights where you can barely see your opponents, especially with the third person assault rifles. I feel like using the SCAR or the FAMAS at really long range really lends itself more to expo than it does linear. Another pro of expo is that it's easier to get used to because the game by default is on expo. If you've never gone into the expo settings and changed it, or the advanced settings and changed it, you've been on exponential this entire time. And also pretty much every other shooter on controller, you're playing on expo. Most games don't even give you the option to choose. This is more of a recent thing within gaming for controller where you can kind of choose the input curve. But if you've been playing shooters for years on controller, you've been playing on expo probably the entire time. Call of Duty, Halo, Battlefield, Rainbow Six, all of these games were expo by default. And then the con of expo is kind of going to be what we talked about before. It's slower at making those large adjustments. And that's really noticeable for building and editing, because pretty much all building and editing is you're moving your stick from one side to the other constantly, the way you do 90s, your stick is all over the place. If you're making an edit play on somebody and then going to shoot them, you're probably like swiping far to the left and then kind of readjusting to the right to hit your shot, and then probably going back to the left to like reset or something. Like there's just a lot of those large adjustments that you're making in Fortnite all of the time. So the pros for Expo, it's easier to use, it's more controlled, it's easier to make those small adjustments, and you're probably already used to it. With linear, it's faster and more responsive. And this is going to feel insane when you first switch to it. The expression people always use when they first switch to linear, that they used a lot when linear first got added, was that they feel like a bobblehead, and you're probably going to have to turn your sensitivity down a little bit. Like 40 cents on linear feels much faster than 40 cents on Expo, just because of the way that slower ramp up time kind of influences things. But linear is much better for like things where you have to make large adjustments, like building, editing, and even shotgun flicks. I feel like especially this season, even in zero build, there's times where you need to make large adjustments, like when people are hammering around or using the shockwave bow. There's a lot of like pretty insane mobility in the game right now, and being able to make large adjustments or kind of like stop on a dime and completely like adjust the opposite direction to hit shots, I feel like linear kind of lends itself more to that, and your sensitivity is more consistent on linear, I feel like. Even though it's harder to get used to, once you're used to it, you kind of have more control, because your sensitivity is going to feel the same all the time. You're going to be able to build that muscle memory. Whereas Expo, your sensitivity is kind of changing based on how much you move the analog stick. The cons of linear, like I kind of talked about before, it's harder to make those small adjustments at medium to long range, especially with the third-person assault rifles. The first-person ARs, like the MK7, the Striker Burst Rifle, and the Red Eye from this season, it's not as hard to make those small adjustments at really long range because it kind of like zooms in for you. I guess it's because it zooms in. I'm not really sure why. But the first-person ARs are much better at long range than the third-person ARs for linear players. But like the Scar and the FAMAS are very inconvenient to use at long range. And then linear is also harder to use or harder to learn because most people are used to Expo, and linear feels incredibly fast and incredibly loose at first, and you're probably going to need to turn your sensitivity down, like I said. One way that you can kind of compensate for it being difficult to make small adjustments on linear when you're aiming is left stick aiming. I've talked about this a bunch, but if you're aiming at somebody and you're just barely off, you can move your character, because moving your character also moves your crosshair, and you can kind of use that left stick to adjust, like make small adjustments left to right in gunfights, and that is like very key to having good tracking on linear at long range. So yeah, those are the pros and cons for each. Like I said at the start of this video, there is no definitive best choice. But if you only play zero build and you don't have any interest in playing builds ever, and you don't really have that much time to play, you probably play like maybe a couple hours a week, Exponential is probably going to be the better choice for you, because it is better at tracking long range, or it's easier to be good at tracking long range on Expo, and it's probably what you're already used to if you've been playing shooters for a long time or just at any point in your life. You're probably already used to Expo, and if you don't have that much time to play and you don't have that much time to practice in creative, it's going to take a long time for you to get used to linear and kind of get back to where you are. But if you're mainly a builds player, or you play both modes, or you just play a lot in general and you have the time to dedicate to it, linear is probably the better choice for you. I feel like linear has a much higher ceiling, but it also has a lower floor, so it just kind of depends on how much time you have to put into the game and how much time you have to practice. So you don't really have to like avoid one or the other. I think it really just depends on your playstyle and what you enjoy. And like I said, the pros and the cons of each are just kind of what the sensitivity lends itself to. You're not going to switch to linear and automatically have godlike building. If you've like, oh, I've always struggled at building, but now this setting will change it. I think linear lends itself to being better at building, but it's not like you're just going to switch to it day one and immediately be better. And then same thing with like the AR tracking long range. Linear isn't as easy to track at long range with assault rifles, or like medium to long range. It's harder to be consistent on linear, but if you put the time in, you certainly can. Like I play on linear, I don't play on Expo, and my AR tracking is usually very, very good at long range. And even with the third person ARs, it's a struggle sometimes. But last season I did get used to the hammer AR, and I feel like my tracking was pretty good with the hammer AR by the end of that season. But when there's first person ARs in the game, it's definitely much easier to play on linear than when it's only third-person ARs. I feel like third-person ARs long range is where linear really struggles, and like I said, you're probably going to need to play on a lower sense on linear than you do on Expo. But that is going to be it for today's video. Just wanted to quickly go over the advantages and disadvantages of each, explain why they are the way they are, and kind of give you my thoughts on which one you should play. Like I said, if you're only zero builds and you don't play that much, Expo is probably better. If you play both, if you only play builds, if you have a lot of time to play, linear is probably better. But let me know down in the comments below which you enjoy, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.